Gun trucks were one of the strangest, most overlooked things to come out of the Vietnam War. They were among the most ambushed units in the whole war. They produced 2 medals of honor, one of which you're going to hear about, and yet they were never even an official branch of the army. They came out of the ambushes that were wrecking the supply convoys, and from rough improvisation, they turned into something nobody had planned for. By the summer of 1967, American ground operations in Vietnam had run into an enormous supply problem. Hundreds of forward bases around the country, especially in the Central Highlands, depended entirely on truck convoys. Every rifle round, every artillery shell, and every gallon of fuel for the helicopters and vehicles came in by truck. Without roads like Route QL19, which ran from the coastal port of Quy Nhon inland to An Khe Pass and the other bases, the whole American presence in the region would have simply fallen apart. The air cavalry was fast and mobile, and it gave the Americans a big edge in the jungle. But the enemy quickly worked out that the whole system rested on the ground supply convoys. Those convoys ran over 100 miles of isolated road, and they were made up of soft-skinned cargo trucks with little or no firepower. And the drivers weren't infantrymen. Most of them were 20-year-old kids with only basic weapons training and a rifle. Their protection was usually just 2 or 3 jeeps with mounted M60 machine guns, plus whatever personal weapons the drivers had. Beyond that, the trucks were sitting ducks. And at first, nobody saw this as a problem. The doctrine had carried over from the Korean War and the wars before it, when ambushes were fairly rare and usually came from smaller, less organized forces. But in Vietnam, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army studied the way the Americans operated, and they understood that the trucks were the weak point of the whole war effort. Unlike the heavily protected fire bases, the convoys moved on a predictable schedule, down known routes and through the jungle, and often with no direct combat support at all. So, the turning point came on the afternoon of September 2nd, 1967, when a convoy from the 8th Transportation Group had already dropped supplies to the 1st Cavalry Division earlier that day, and it was making the return run along Route QL19. Accounts of the column vary, putting it at anywhere between 40 and 90 vehicles. A large fuel tanker at the rear couldn't keep pace, and that split the convoy into 2 sections with a gap of about 500 meters between them. That worried the convoy commander, because with only 2 or 3 jeeps and their M60s for security, the 2 halves couldn't really support each other if they got hit. The road had dense jungle within about 10 feet of its edge and sharp, blind turns that badly cut visibility. It later picked up the nickname Ambush Alley, and you're about to see why. Now, up on the slope above the road, somewhere between 60 and 80 North Vietnamese soldiers were dug into prepared fighting positions, camouflaged and waiting. As the lead vehicles entered the kill zone, an enemy round hit the lead jeep, killing a soldier instantly and wounding others. One account calls it a 57mm rocket, another a recoilless rifle round. Then a line of mines, some mounted on wooden planks and pulled across the road, went off, disabling trucks and stopping the column cold. And then the whole hillside opened up with claymore mines, automatic weapons, recoilless rifles, and rocket-propelled grenades. The drivers, with only M14 or M16 rifles and a few magazines, were caught completely off guard. Some tried to fire back from their vehicles, others jumped out and fought from the roadside. At least 3 trucks were overrun by fighters who climbed onto the cabs and threw satchel charges inside or fired through the windshields. The rear fuel tanker was hit and started burning, though it didn't explode. The ambush zone ran from about 700 meters to nearly a kilometer, and within 10 minutes, some 30 vehicles were destroyed or disabled. Between 7 and 9 Americans were killed and 17 more wounded. A lot of the drivers didn't even know what the standard procedure was. Nobody had expected this, but the North Vietnamese had set it up as a deliberate test run to probe the convoy system, time the American response, and see how long they themselves had before gunships or reaction forces showed up. And what they learned that day, they'd use against the Americans for years. A company from the 1st Cavalry Division, based less than a mile away, moved out and reached the site in about 10 to 15 minutes, and gunships eventually helped push the enemy off the hill. But by then, they had mostly slipped back into the jungle, and the damage was done. You see, before that day, driving a truck wasn't thought of as frontline duty, but after that, none of the drivers had that illusion anymore. They were prime targets now, and the army had to move fast. The military police stepped up their route patrols and took on more of the checkpoints, and engineers brought in roam plows to cut wide lanes along the jungle roads to strip back the cover the ambushers hid in. It helped a little, but it wasn't enough. The road was just too long, too remote, and impossible to make safe along its whole length, and the enemy knew the jungle and knew guerrilla warfare too well to miss that. Something had to ride alongside the loaded trucks as they crawled through the hills and sharp turns. Tanks and armored fighting vehicles were scarce, and the ones that existed were already busy at the front. So, the real fix came from inside the transportation group, from the young drivers themselves, most of them barely in their 20s. The first step was to take what they already had, the 2.5-ton M35 cargo trucks they called the Deuce and a Half, and try to turn them into mobile fighting units. They lined the beds with sandbags, wooden boxes, or plywood for protection, and mounted 1 or 2 machine guns. And then the first heavy rain came. The sandbags soaked up water like sponges, got heavy, overloaded the trucks, cracked suspensions and axles, and caused overheating. That's when they started switching to steel, and that changed everything. Mechanics and engineers in the field started cutting armor off wrecked vehicles, abandoned landing craft, and downed helicopters. When they couldn't find enough, they tactically borrowed steel plate from other bases, which is a polite way of saying they stole it. But when lives depended on it, you did what you had to. The steel was cut and welded around the truck's cargo bed to make the 4 walls of an armored box, thick enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel. They often added an inner steel wall with a gap between the layers, and this spaced armor gave some protection even against light anti-tank rockets. Sandbags, planks, or rubber went on the floor to soften mine blasts, which were a big threat. They welded plating around the cab, the engine, the fuel tanks, and the other vital parts because if the truck stopped in the kill zone, the crew was dead. Every gun truck ended up being its own thing depending on what materials were around and who was building it. Each one got a nickname painted on and a black finish to look more intimidating. The first armament was just 1 or 2 M60 machine guns, but the 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun soon became the preferred choice. These trucks were the only real protection the crews had against ambushes that were getting worse and worse, and they didn't have to wait long to see them work. Later, in 1967, a convoy came under heavy fire from automatic weapons and grenades, and the gun truck at the rear opened up right away with its machine guns and pushed forward to protect the cargo trucks. It took some hits, but going straight at the enemy like that drove them off. From there, the gun trucks spread fast. They kept experimenting with spaced armor to beat the shaped charges from RPGs and armor-piercing rounds, and eventually they got standard pre-cut armor plates, so they didn't have to scavenge scrapyards anymore. The 2.5-ton trucks were soon replaced by the heavier M54 5-ton trucks, which could carry more armor and heavier weapons without overheating on the steep hills, and those became the main platform. They even gave M51 dump trucks a try, but the most radical modification of all was to load an M113 armored personnel carrier onto a cargo bed. They took damaged, knocked-out carriers and stripped off the tracks, engines and drivetrains until only the armored shell was left. Then, they mounted that shell on an M54 truck, using it as a ready-made armored gun box. It was top-heavy and left the truck overloaded and unbalanced, which hurt performance and made rollovers more likely. But it worked, and it kept the crew alive, which was the whole point. Several of these were built in different setups, with the hull facing forward or backward, depending on the job and how the crew wanted the truck balanced. And the weapons evolved just as fast. You see, the most important moment in an ambush is the first few seconds after it's sprung. So the goal was to put out as much firepower as possible in the shortest time, to overwhelm the attackers, pin them down, and let the convoy either break through or push them back. On most gun trucks, the crews mounted several M60s on pivoting platforms inside the gun box, so they could cover more than one direction at once. Each gun fired around 600 rounds a minute, and some trucks carried double or even triple mounts to multiply that. Then came the 50 caliber M2 machine guns for more stopping and suppressive power, sometimes in twin mounts. Now, the heaviest setup was the M45 max and quad mount, a turret holding 4 M2 heavy machine guns, originally built for anti-aircraft defense. This quad 50 could put out 2,000 rounds a minute and throw up enough fire to break an ambush team in the opening moments. Rarer but also very effective was the M134 minigun, which crews sometimes pulled off downed helicopters and rigged onto their trucks. One famous gun truck named Pure Hell even mounted a minigun with the electric motor stripped off and worked it with a hand crank, just like a Gatling gun from the Civil War. And however strange some of these setups looked, they were only part of it. The trucks also carried thousands of rounds of ammunition, along with M79 grenade launchers, M72 light anti-tank weapons, and plenty of grenades. On top of that, they also carried so-called unauthorized weapons, a lot of them from the Second World War, and they often liked them better than some of the newer guns they were issued. They were older, but they were proven in combat and trusted for their reliability and stopping power. You could find BARs, Thompson submachine guns, M3 grease guns, M1 Garand, and even captured AK-47s aboard the trucks. The gun trucks were spread throughout a convoy, usually one at the front, one in the middle, and one at the rear. At first, the crews thought that one gun truck for every 10 cargo trucks was enough, but that turned out to be wrong, and the ratio was changed to 1 for every 5 whenever they could manage it. When an ambush was sprung, the cargo trucks pushed on to get out of the kill zone. The gun trucks drove toward the gunfire and gave what protection they could, and they pulled wounded drivers out of disabled trucks and got everyone away as fast as possible. So, there were really two main ways to deal with an ambush. One was to drive to the edge of the kill zone and lay down suppressive fire, though more often it meant driving straight into the kill zone, especially when cargo trucks had been hit. The other tactic was called bumping. In a long convoy, the lead gun truck would stop briefly in the kill zone and fire until the next gun truck came up and took its place. Then, the first one could move on with the rest of the column, so no part of the convoy was ever left without protection. The crews didn't really like escorting fuel tankers and ammunition trucks, since they were even more dangerous if they got hit. But those loads often made up most of a convoy, and the men who drove them ran a serious risk of their own. Also, when a convoy got hit, tanks and helicopters were sent to help, but often got there too late, after the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese had already vanished into the jungle. And AC-47 spooky gunships could be called in to spray the jungle with their miniguns, though it was hard to tell how much good it did. The Americans even used Agent Orange to strip the leaves off the trees beside the roads and take away the cover the ambush teams depended on. And everything they'd learned came together on one road, on one day. On February 23rd, 1971, 2 fuel convoys were moving along Route 19 under the protection of several gun trucks. The 5-ton gun truck Brutus, with Sergeant Hector Diaz standing in as its leader, was near the front. They were working through a stretch of road near An Khe Pass, a known hotspot for ambushes. As the lead convoy reached a sharp bend at the top of the pass, a large group of North Vietnamese soldiers opened fire. The enemy first hit the gun truck Creeper with a rocket that blew out its tires, but even stuck in place, the Creeper's crew kept firing. The gun truck Playboys then rushed toward the kill zone. When an enemy soldier tried to knock it out with a B-40 rocket, the driver hit the brakes so the rocket missed, and the crew killed the attacker with their .50 caliber. On the convoy commander's order, the Playboys then pulled up beside a damaged fuel tanker and poured fire into the enemy, scattering a lot of them, and the fight dragged on for nearly 20 minutes. Down at the bottom of the pass were other gun trucks from the convoy, Brutus, the Misfits, the Untouchable, and Lil Brutus. They heard the call for help and raced up the mountain into the kill zone, with the minigun on Brutus leading the way. With 5 gun trucks and a tank now in the fight, they could lay down heavy fire. But Brutus was stuck in the middle of 6 fuel tankers. It held its spot as 2 of them went up in flames, then took a rocket that killed crewman Callison and wounded 2 others, but it still stayed in the fight. However, halfway through the firefight, the minigun on Brutus jammed. As Diaz and a crewman named Hauer worked to clear it, the firing suddenly stopped and everything went quiet. And that's when a squad of North Vietnamese charged out of the jungle at the truck. One of them threw a grenade into the open gun box. Specialist Larry Dahl saw it, shouted a warning, and threw himself onto the grenade. The blast killed him instantly and wounded the rest of the crew, but it saved them, because the grenade would otherwise have killed everyone in the box. The driver, Mallory, was hit by shrapnel but could still drive. The wounded Hauer stayed conscious and kept radioing him to get them out, and Mallory pushed through the smoke and flames of the burning tankers and brought Brutus to a checkpoint where a medevac helicopter was waiting. Larry Dahl was awarded the Medal of Honor after his death, and he stands for the men of Vietnam's gun trucks. Brutus was one of an estimated 300 to 400 trucks converted this way. The senior officers had always seen the gun truck as a temporary fix, meant to last only until enough V-100 armored cars showed up. But by 1970, it was clear to everybody that the V-100 was a death trap once its armor was punched through, and it had powertrain problems on top of that. So, the gun trucks kept serving until the last American truck company in South Vietnam was shut down in 1972. When the war ended, most gun trucks were either scrapped or put back to carrying cargo. However, one M54, named Eve of Destruction by its crew, made it home in one piece and is on display at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia. The trucks themselves were taken apart and left behind, but the idea didn't die. It grew into the modern convoy protection vehicles in use today. But in Vietnam, they were the lifeline of the American forces out there.